Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. Today I'm going to show you how to add an oil pressure sensor to your BMW. Okay, so let's get this unboxed. This kit is made by AEM. I'll put a link in the description. This is a 100 psi 1/8 NPT oil pressure sensor. The kit comes with a connector and bits to assemble your own wiring harness. And I purchased this separately. So this is a male to female 10AN fitting, and it has the correct threads for that pressure sensor. Okay, so here's the oil pressure sensor on this BMW. If you unplug the connector, if you see in there, there's literally just one pin. The other side is empty and there's one wire to sense. It just basically senses between ground to see if there is pressure or not. Is there a complete circuit to ground? If there's any type of pressure enough to overcome whatever the spring tension is inside here, probably just 20 or 30 psi, then it will complete this circuit and you will get no warning light. If there's low oil pressure, this would lose its mechanical pressure, and then this would short and you would have a warning saying you don't have oil pressure. It doesn't tell you exactly how much. So by the time you're at the point where there's critical low oil pressure, it'll probably be too late. So here's the sensor I want to install. There's 3 pins, 5 volts, and then you have your ground and then output. So there's a potentiometer in here, and depending on the spring tension and oil pressure inside the sensor, it will vary the resistance and vary the amount of voltage that can make it through the pin. It will go between 0.5 volts and 4 volts. At any given time, it can tell you what the oil pressure is depending on the position inside here, how much pressure is pushing against the spring, and where that piece is in relation to the body here. That will vary the resistance and pass a different voltage through. So if you're running low on oil pressure, you'll know right away, because the sensor can tell you. It's not just going to tell you there's no oil pressure, critical, shut off the engine. It'll tell you, hey, you could be experiencing a problem coming down the line, don't be on your car. So the fact that these cars come with an oil pressure sensor that just senses for just basic oil pressure and doesn't tell you where you're at is not a good idea, in my opinion. You're going to be left in the dark if your engine's about to fail. Now, you may get a plausibility error if you're low on oil pressure, saying that there's a plausibility that the sensor's failing, because you'll be right at the lower range of where this could complete its circuit. But regardless, bad design. And I think this design cost me thousands of dollars, and let me explain. If you haven't been following my channel, that's my old motor, and it failed after I changed my rod bearings because I probably had incorrect clearances. And oil pressure would have definitely told me whether or not I was in a good range or if I was in a danger zone. So now I'm going to make sure that I put that oil pressure sensor and integrate it with my car. I'm going to have to get this out of the way. So if you notice, I have an aftermarket oil cooler. So you can't necessarily follow this to a T if you want to install an oil pressure sensor on your car, but I wanted to include this information for you guys just to show you how to wire them up, and then you can kind of take it from there and apply it to your own application. So basically, this will thread in here, the line will go down a little bit, and then this will screw into the side of it, like so. And then I can run my wiring and get it into the interior. Now, if you have a factory oil cooler and you're looking to do this still, then I can link to a kit that VTT makes in the description that allows you to integrate a pressure sensor on your car, and then you'll actually remotely mount it. In my case, since I had this setup, it was just very easy to go this route. Another prerequisite is going to be this P3 gauge that I have. This is just the easiest way for me to integrate and install the oil pressure sensor. But if you don't have this, then you're going to have to go about it a different route. You may have to buy an actual oil pressure gauge. You could buy the vent insert and then stick your gauge here if you wanted to add an aftermarket oil pressure sensor. I'll put a link in the description for a couple options and a couple of vent solutions you could look into. Or you could just go with this P3 gauge and then get a boost gauge out of the deal. That would be my recommendation because it's pretty handy to have. So I'll link that down below as well. It's important to think about where you're going to be threading this into place, the sensor on the side, and how you lock this line down. That should work. So I had to reorient my lines a little bit just to make these clear each other properly. So they say you got to think about vibration with these. This fitting is suspended. It's like it's got some flex in it. They can actually move even though they're fully tight. So the vibration won't really translate to this, which should help with its longevity. They redesigned this flange to make sure that the O-ring will always stay seated properly, and these things have a little bit of free range of motion. So that's a tapered thread. You don't have to go nuts tightening it down. It won't bottom out if you guys are wondering. Now I'm going to start setting up the wiring. I'm going to set up the connector now. I'm using the supplied pins that they give you. This will be the 5-volt supply that'll come from the gauge. I don't have proper crimp connectors, so I'm just kind of makeshifting this. And the 5-volt signal goes into here. This is the last one. It's going to be your output from the sensor to the gauge, the signal that will vary. Like so. Let's do a test plug-in. Seems good. So I pop this piece out, and down in there, one of those little tubes that are sticking out, I'm going to cut the end of it and shove the harness through there, which you can make out just right there. I'll take this lower cover off now, 3 220s. So we have 2 wires here. It's 5-volt analog 1, and then we have 5-volt analog 2. So we can take 5 volts from the purple and we can feed back into the blue, and we just got to tap into one of these black wires here for ground right here. So I have my 3 wires here brought through the firewall. I got my brown for ground, and I have my 5-volt supply, which is going to come from that gauge, and then I have my return from the sensor. So I'm going to start with soldering in my ground here to the ground for this module itself. Now I'm bringing my 5-volt supply to the purple wire on this P3 gauge. Last up, the output from the sensor goes to the blue wire input on the gauge. Okay, so before I button everything away, I'm going to configure the gauge now so we can make sure everything's working with the wiring. So my bad, I actually tapped power from the wrong wire. It was just an off purple color, but that was actually one of the inputs. So I shouldn't have done that, analog 1. So it's actually off of the main harness here for the boost sensor that you want your purple wire. So take power from that. Okay, so take 2, I fixed the wiring. I took the purple wire off the boost sensor and now I'm actually fed into analog 2, which is blue. Okay, here's the chart for the sensor. 0.5 volts is 0 psi. 4.5 volts is 100 psi. So we have to figure out what we'd be at 5 volts, which would be 112.5 psi if that was theoretically possible. This gauge is designed to look for 0 to 5 volt signals, so we kind of have to tell it what it would have been, even though it will never reach that value. And then we're not going to run decimal places, we're just going to round up. And so we're going to call it 113 psi at 5 volts, and then negative 13 psi at 0 volts, because every quarter volt is 6.25 psi. So our range is negative 13 to 113 psi, 0 to 5 volts, no decimal places. We have to put that into the gauge and tell it what to look for. So what we're going to do is hit both these buttons at the same time, get into the configuration menu, hit the right button, analog 1, that's normally where you'd be feeding from. I ended up on analog 2, the blue wire, but if you went on the brown wire, you'd be on analog 1. But I'm just doing the same thing, but on analog 2. So we're going to go down to analog 2, cycle through to where it says yes with the left button, and then we're going to hit the right button. We're going to leave the decimal places at 9999. I just wanted to round up. Our low value is supposed to be negative 13. So there you go. Our high value is supposed to be 113. So negative 13 to 113 is our range. And then we press and hold this to reboot the device and save those settings. Now I'll give it a start and see what our cold pressure is. The engine's not stone cold because I had it running maybe about half an hour ago to full operating temperature, or actually about an hour ago, where I was playing around with the settings to figure this all out. So that is, it's barely at 120 degrees Fahrenheit, warm, restart, 73 psi. So we'll let that run. I'll let the oil get up to temperature and I'll show you what the hot temperature is, and then we can kind of go from there. But if I give it some gas, you see it goes up. I'll let it finish the cold start, let the thermostat open up for the oil cooler, and then we'll see where we end up in terms of oil pressure. So that's how everything looks. So as you can see, as the oil gets up to temperature, it starts to thin out and the pressure will drop. But that's a good sign of a healthy motor overall. I have good oil pressure. And you can kind of use this as a gauge to when you should really start beating on the car. You want it to be up to full operating temperature, and you want these values to be at what you'd expect for a warm engine. Not just going by temperature, you can go by viscosity. And if your motor's about to go or you're running low on oil pressure, you can verify right there. If you're missing your cage inside your oil filter housing, or you're getting weird Vanos codes, etc., now you can verify oil pressure. And just as an FYI, I'm running 5W40 in there right now. From what I understand, fully hot, it would be running idling at around low 20s, and then when you're on things, it'll get into 60s and 70s. And then when it's cold, it'll be closer to 100 on cold start, etc. But overall, you want to be at least 20 psi. If it's somewhere in 20 to 30 range at fully warmed up, that would be considered normal. I may end up closer to the 30s because I'm running thicker oil, but we'll see. The oil temperature is approaching about 150 Fahrenheit now. So a general rule of thumb is watch your idle PSI. If it's down in the 40s, you know you can start pushing the car. Up here at the front, it's leak free. We're in good shape. It has to be cost-cutting measures as to why these cars don't come with a pressure sensor from the factory, and there's no way to data log it. You have to add an aftermarket sensor if you want that level of visibility into the health of your engine. If I was running my motor after I changed the bearings and those values didn't match up to what I had read online and what I was used to seeing, I'd know not to push the car, and I would have looked into my rod bearings. So yes, there's some prerequisites that are involved based on the way I installed things. You need that adapter, you need the sensor, etc., and you need the P3 gauge. But if you want to run universal oil pressure gauge in your vent or through a gauge pod, and you want another solution for mounting the sensor externally away from here without needing to upgrade your oil cooler, then I'll link to the two solutions for you in the description so you can still kind of follow along. Alright guys, that'll conclude this video showing you how to add an oil pressure sensor to your BMW. In my opinion, they should have come this way from the factory. This could really save your engine. If this is the first video you're catching on mine, please consider subscribing. I do upload regularly. Thanks for watching.